Well, it's the top of the hour, and so why don't we get this webinar underway? First of all, I'd just like to welcome all of you to the conversation about how to navigate through the American Rescue Plan Act, with specific attention being focused on equity and inclusiveness. My name is Matt Fulton. I'm the Vice President for National Engagement with Polco. I'm now using my background as a city manager for over 3 decades to help communities build stronger engagement and track performance from the perspectives of residents, businesses, and employees. You know, engaging with your community stakeholders is such an important part of understanding priorities and expectations. Our collective experience over the last 16 months have probably elevated the importance of engagement in all of our communities, and just understanding how the world has shifted, because it has been impacted in so many different ways. And to help guide you and inform you on the ways that you can move your communities forward. Fact of the matter is, engagement has never been easy. And especially as you think about all of those marginal voices and the hard to reach populations. There's just so much community noise going on in our worlds right now, and those loud minority voices that impact our abilities to truly understand community sentiment. And so the conversation today is really around the hope that you will be able to benefit from the information that we plan on sharing with you, to help you navigate your way through the ARPA program, and to help you meet the needs and the priorities of all your residents, so that you're able to consider the best ways to meet your needs of the community. It's very difficult to think about all of the shifts and the changes that have happened in our worlds over the last 16 months or so. You know, it's impacted everything in our life. What was a priority in 2018 is probably, or may very well not be, a priority today. Business closures, unemployment, housing challenges, public health issues, all of those kinds of things that we have historically built into strategic plans to meet the needs of our communities have probably shifted in one way or another. Pandemic has impacted the different segments of our communities in very different ways. And that's why it's so critical to make sure that you've got a good understanding of what the current priorities are, so that you have the ability to address those long-term community investment issues and areas that can meet all of the needs of all of your residents in an equitable and inclusive way. The ARPA program is a very unique federal program, and it's an opportunity for you to set your communities up for future success and sustainability. So as you start thinking about the ARPA program and how to use the funds for overall recovery, especially with an eye of thinking about equitableness and inclusiveness, you really do need to first understand what the current needs and the priorities are. And that's where the critical importance of engagement comes in, for getting input and the perspectives and sentiments of your residents, businesses, and stakeholders in that overall process. You know, honestly, having a better understanding of current overall needs can actually help save on the level of expenditures that you find yourself allocating, because you'll have a much better ability to have an understanding of where the current needs and perspectives and alignment of resources are. Our research has shown that trust in local government over the past 16 months has actually increased when compared to the state and national government. You know, my guess is that most of you have experienced an increase in the level of your engagement and the attention of your residents. And it probably makes a lot of sense, because local governments generally, in times of crisis, really step up to the plate and address the needs of your residents. But I also think that it's really the fact that we have gone so much of a virtual world that we've made things a lot more convenient and made it easier for residents to connect on the decision making and the processes that you're using for meeting the needs of your community stakeholders. As you listen to the conversation today, think about the importance of local government to tell a bigger story about how ARPA funds have been used and how to help communities across the country recover. We're going to be talking about the Polco's ARPA engagement package, which can help communities understand overall community needs and assess the effectiveness of the use of these funds in meeting community long-term investment needs and the pandemic recovery. The benefit of it, though, is it's structured in a way that you're going to be able to understand local needs, but we're also going to be able to aggregate it on a much broader scale, so that we have the ability to tell a broader story and a larger story about how communities generally have been able to address economic recovery, equity and inclusiveness recovery, all of those things that really matter to our communities. It's important as local leaders, I think, to really be able to demonstrate that the ARPA program funds were used effectively in moving all of our communities forward. in a meaningful and positive way with an equity eye and an inclusiveness eye. It's a very important aspect of what we're hoping to be able to share with you today. And I hope you'll pick up on that and appreciate the value. I think it's a really important thing for us to be able to demonstrate the value of local government so that as we build on that engagement, we'll be able to just take advantage of the elevated level of engagement of our residents in helping us to develop plans for moving communities forward. Next slide. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to be spending some time with several panelists and leaders in local government. We've got a great panel of well-recognized thought leaders and professionals who are going to be able to help us all better understand the importance of the ARPA program and share information about how the data can be used to help inform decisions and describe tools that are available to you to help navigate the overall ARPA program. The Emerging Local Government Leaders Organization, most of us recognize it as ElGL, has been supporting the needs of all levels of local government over the past decade. I'm really looking forward to hearing about how ElGL is supporting the needs of its member communities, striving to address equity and inclusiveness in the delivery of public services. And I'm sure all of us appreciate the value of the ICMA Annual Awards Program. We have the pleasure of having Monrovia, California, who will be recognized at the upcoming ICMA Annual Conference in Portland for a project that they implemented focused on bringing the community together. We're going to be hearing how Monrovia is working to ensure equity and inclusiveness in the work that they do in their community. And then finally, we'll share some information with you about Polco's ARPA engagement package. It's been designed to help communities work through the ARPA program, assess overall needs of the community, and to kind of measure the effectiveness of how well ARPA is helping you to move your communities forward. Like every webinar, feel free to provide questions in the chat as we go through. We've programmed time at the end for responding to them. We're also providing a short Polco survey at the end of the session to get your feedback on the session and to learn a little bit more about where you are in the ARPA program and how we can continue to help the work that you're doing. So let me, excuse me, let me introduce our panelists. Amie Hendrix is a member of the ElGL Board of Directors and is the Deputy County Administrator in Tompkins County, New York. Dylan Feik is the City Manager in Monrovia, California. And Michelle Kobayashi is a founder of the National Research Center with over 20 years of survey science experience and is now Polco's Senior Vice President for Innovation. Let me thank you again for attending and would now love to bring in Amie for a conversation about how ElGL is helping communities meet local equity and inclusiveness goals. Amie, thanks for being here. ElGL is such an important member organization supporting local governments across the country. So first, congratulations on the work that you're doing and all of the ways that you're supporting members that are working in local government. You know, as ElGL considers the value that ARPA resources can provide in supporting the community recovery, with an eye on the important topic of equity and inclusion, there's a couple of areas that I'd love to talk to you about. Can you talk about the strategies and the approaches that ElGL is encouraging communities to consider as local leaders strive to address community equity and inclusion in the delivery of public services?
Sure. Thanks for having me today and talking a little bit about ElGL. So I've been on the board. This is my second year on the board. And one of the things that really ElGL does well, for those of you that are members, you probably know, is connecting communities, making sure that people have resources throughout the various organizations that they can call upon. And they do this in a variety of ways. One of the ways is through our cohort programs, through having community connections on Slack channels and other ways. But when we start talking about diversity, equity, inclusion work, what we're talking about is making sure that our members have the resources that they need. And equity and inclusion is fundamental to ElGL, and making sure that there is diverse membership on the board that people can reach out to, as well as that we have information. So a few years ago, we launched what we call the diversity dashboard, looking at local governments and how they are reflective of the communities, and how do we work with them to really understand the demographics of local government. Because when you start to discuss reaching into your communities and having that understanding, a big piece of that is making sure that it's reflective collective. And I think that's similar when we start talking about the ARPA funding, that we need to know what's going on in the community. And the best way to do that is being there. The other resources that ElGL offers is the opportunity to share. As I mentioned, they have cohort programs where we're trying to build the capacity of the different ElGL members. ElGL members come from all areas of public service, or not always just public service, people that care about public service. So I think that's another piece, is there's a lot of resources there. Local government leaders know what they're doing, what's working and what's not working. They can learn from one another. And so participating in things like cohort programs where you can really dive deeper, that's always been helpful. I know we have current cohorts going on, but there also are cohorts that have happened in the past, things like sprint cohorts, which in this case, you know, it's something that I think the organization is really good at doing if there's a need. Setting something up. So a sprint cohort is a short 6-week program that allows the participants really a chance to explore a topic or skill. And we've done things in the past that have included community engagement. And so learning from those cohort programs, they also often create what we call morning buzz, which is a morning blog post that has a variety of topics. So just searching through that, I think leaders can find different ways to really understand what other places have done and building up on that. There are other cohort programs as well as other opportunities to connect, but that's the main focus of ElGL, is really connecting people and learning from the collective of everyone, because everyone has something else that they can share.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's really interesting. You know, ElGL has been recognized for a long time about building leadership capacity in local government. Can you talk about how you go about doing that, particularly just given all of the enormous challenges that local government leaders have been confronting over the last year? How can ElGL help, or what programs do you have in place to help with that?
Yeah, those connections are key, and hearing from our membership. I think that's one of the things is, as a board member on ElGL, we welcome all of our new members personally. It's not canned emails, it's not canned postcards, it's written letters, thank you notes, stickers. If you're an ElGL member, you know that we have a lot of stickers. But it's welcoming people personally and making that connection. And it, as I mentioned, it's all levels of government. So it's helping people understand their pathways. I think that's another piece, is you don't always see where that path can go. When we're talking about funding and equity and inclusion and our own people, it's helping them see those paths. And so again, using those different programs, reaching out to one another, connecting with each other. I know that I just got an email from Kirsten today, who's our executive director, connecting me with other people that have similar sized communities or are working with the same population, that maybe we can help one another. One of the things about local government is we're all in this together, because we're building these systems off of systems that have been around for a long time. And sometimes that change can be difficult and time consuming. And the opportunities to share that difficulty is really, really fortunate for all of us. And I think that's something that I've learned, is to have that network and have those people that I can count on. So through all of the different experiences, whether it's just that one time, you know, reading that blog post or morning buzz post, listening to podcasts, the Gov Love podcast has a lot of variety, a lot of resources, a lot of experts coming on there. So definitely something to look into.
You know, that's really great. ElGL has done such a great job, but the notion of engagement is difficult. Equity and inclusion considerations are always difficult, especially through navigating this ARPA program. But you combine that with the leadership building programs that you have and all of those different avenues. And I love the fact that you're talking about we're all in this thing together, because that is the truth. And so taking advantage of those resources, I think, is really helpful and great recommendations to provide to folks. So thank you very much for that. You know, in your role in Tompkins County as the deputy administrator, can you talk a little bit about how you have conducted your community needs assessment as you've been preparing for the ARPA program and the allocation of ARPA resources, especially thinking about the equity and inclusion question?
Sure. So I'll start by saying how we're looking at the ARPA funds or the ARPA funds. We are going to be looking at the cash for capital. And so we'll be investing those direct funds into some of our capital costs. And so our legislature made a resolution to do that. At the same time, they are creating a community recovery fund out of our fund balance to respond to the pandemic and other things that were highlighted in the ARPA funds. Now, the reason for doing that is really part of it is the monitoring compliance piece. So we are using those funds directly for our capital expenses and putting it into our capital program. And also acknowledging that those funds are meant for community programs and our partnerships. And we had reached out prior to our first expanded budget committee, which is a committee of the whole. We have 14 elected officials that make up our legislature. So that committee of the whole met to discuss how they wanted to approach using these funds. And prior to that meeting, we did a community survey and had varied responses on how to use the funding. I think one of the things that's challenging is everyone has heard, or most people have heard, that this federal funding is coming to the local municipalities, but not really the guidance on how it can be used, or the fact that there is guidance. It's not exactly a free-for-all. We can't give it kind of in the ways that I think some people would like us. So moving that into that cash for capital category, using it to cover our capital costs, and then using fund balance dollars. We have a significant fund balance right now, so it made sense to pull some of that funding out. It won't cover our total ARPA funds, but it will make, it's providing to the community. Now, how we're gonna actually put that program together is still being determined. I will say one of the things that we really leveraged is our community partnerships and networks. The last year and a half, the community has depended on us. And we've built lists of individuals and people that we can reach out to directly and ensure that we're meeting all those communities. As we started doing things like vaccination rollouts, we realized that we needed more translation services and we needed to work with the communities to translate those things, which means overall we created a new translation policy and we invested in that. So as we're starting to hear from the communities, we're reaching out in their language with people that they're working with. We also created a public health ambassador program, which is turning into a community ambassador program. And these are individuals who live in different communities, speak multiple languages in some cases, and are throughout our county, that can then go directly to people to encourage them to respond. We have, a migrant population here. We have a large farm worker population who's undocumented. We had some COVID flare-ups in that community. We built in going to them, providing testing, providing assistance there, and again, built trust in that community that maybe wouldn't have been there or probably wasn't there 18 to 20 months ago. But because we went there, we came in while we are government, we didn't disrupt or put in new laws, policies in place, we can now hear from them. I think that approach is going to do us well, and continuing to have that focus on hearing from everyone, having that flexibility with those funds to look at who has also been most impacted, using the data that we have. We've built our data team out a little bit so they can look at what's going on, who's impacted by the COVID pandemic, how we can actually meet their needs. Is really key to all of this. So while we're approaching it a little differently, and we'll be using our own funds to kind of do a lot of what the ARPA funds were meant to do while using that on the capital side of things, I think it really does make a lot of sense to continue to push it. It also allows us to extend the program in some ways because we're not as tied to the time limitations as the ARPA funds are. So while we knew that there was some timelines there, we'll be using our capital funds and at the same time looking to invest multiple years potentially of fund balance funds to continue some of these programs.
That's awesome. Congratulations on that work. It's a great example of how you've had to adapt over the last year and a half to meet the needs of your community. Whenever we do conversations or talk about engagement, especially as you're starting to think about those hard to reach populations, we always talk about finding those trusted community partners, people that can help us bring those populations into the conversation. And so it sounds like your ambassador program is doing exactly that. But Amie, would you mind kind of expanding, kind of thinking about those hard to reach populations? For folks that are paying attention and listening to this webinar, do you have any strategies or approaches that have been successful in your community for helping to reach those hard to reach populations?
Yeah, I think one of the big pieces was finding who are the natural leaders in those populations and how we interface with them, and identifying them probably in non-traditional settings. It's not always the faith leader at the front of the religious organization. It may be the person that sits in the back row that is really the leader of that organization. And when you talk about, faith leaders or community organizers, they may not be the ones that usually work with the government, I will say. Sometimes they are our loudest people at the public comment sessions. And at the same time, when something like a pandemic is starting to hit communities that really needs that focus, it's bringing them in. It's bringing them in and listening. I will say we've had some really unpleasant conversations, not just about COVID, but also we went through a major reimagining public safety process where we allowed everyone to speak for unlimited amounts of time. And then we had staff members who then reached out to people who were really unhappy or wanted to share more and spent time just listening. That took a large investment of resources because, my chief equity diversity officer, she came on during all of this and is phenomenal. She spent many days just listening to people and not doing anything else but just hearing them out and then coming up with solutions she could take back to them. The follow through on that was really, really a huge piece of that, because I think sometimes listening is the first step, but people have to know that you're actually ready to take action. And also over explaining what that action may look like. As we start to get into this funding piece, sometimes these things aren't going to be immediate and it may not be the solution that was recommended. So it's hearing the people out, explaining what is going to be implemented and why. And then if the feedback is still negative, being okay with that. I think that's something sometimes leaders struggle with, is we don't have the solutions that are going to be perfect for everyone. All we can do is really take in the data, the evidence, and push forward what we think is going to make the most sense for our community.
Yeah, that is very well said. Thank you for bringing up the topic of follow through as well. Local government operates on the basis of trust. And part of that trust is being transparent and providing that follow through so that folks that do engage and get involved in the process have a sense for what decisions were made and how their engagement was considered and incorporated. And even if it wasn't considered, being able to be okay with that whole aspect. So I really appreciate those comments and really appreciate you being part of this conversation today. Thanks for your work with ElGL and for the work you're doing with the county, and just really appreciate you being here today. Let me pull Dylan into the conversation. Dylan is the city manager in Monrovia, California. We had an earlier conversation before the session about one of his neighborhood issues being bears in the community. And so let's switch from the bear population issue, Dylan, to talking about the celebration of your award by ICMA for your work around equity and inclusion. Thanks for being part of the conversation. And I'd love to have you share a little bit about the recognition that Monrovia has just been recognized for, and the work that you're doing in supporting your community's equity and inclusion work.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Matt. I appreciate being here as always. Our recent award is a wonderful surprise, especially after the year we just all came through. Our program, we call it Neighborhood Treasures, and it's been a program we've been doing for nearly 5 years. It was an effort for the city to bring several different groups involved, including our Art and Public Places Committee, our staff, our general members of the public. We also have a team we call our Monrovia Area Partnership. It's kind of our 20-year leadership development program, kind of like a leadership Monrovia kind of program. We brought people together. It was a way to identify Monrovians and the differences they've made on our community, even in the region, and even nationally. Last year when John Lewis passed away, we also learned that we had a local Monrovian who was marching in Alabama the same day that Mr. Lewis was marching in Alabama. Most of the community didn't know that. And I think so many of us tend to focus on local government and the way we've always done local government. And if anything, Monrovia, we wanted to embrace this idea of how do we step back and honor those people who have really made a difference. So the Neighborhood Treasures program is several community groups coming together. We identify these local heroes and we build nice, small public art pieces throughout the community, particularly in those physical locations where the person may have lived, where they may have taught class, where they actually were working to make a difference. On Saturday, we're dedicating our next Neighborhood Treasures program. The art piece, it's a wonderful piece. Leroy Chris was an African-American Tuskegee Airman. He was Monrovia's pilot many years ago. And so we're building a beautiful monument to him that's got not only his face and a story about who he was, but even beautiful artwork showing the airplane that he actually flew back in the World War. So we're really excited about the history, the culture. But what we're really most proud of is that we found a way to bring people together at a very nominal cost to the city and honor those people who have made a difference. So we're excited to receive the award from ICMA. We'll look forward to sharing more information about it in the coming months. Certainly happy to answer any questions people might have. And you can even go to the city's website and see some of our cool art and public places activities. We have several diversity related programs that I think are wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. That's very cool. You know, public art has just this natural ability to pull people together. So as you start to think about including all of the voices in the community in the things that you do in local government and just building that trust factor, that's such a relevant way to do a lot of that work. Can you talk about how you're incorporating your equity and inclusion goals overall, how you're incorporating them into your daily work and long-term strategies?
You know, I think I'm going to refer to something Amie said, which I thought was really important. She said in the work of ElGL, her words were, we're building systems over time. And in 2021 local government, there's this expectation that we move fast, we do things quickly. In my mind, in my belief, you know, direction is so much more important than speed. And communicating that is important. Last year in June, when we were all experiencing frankly the trauma of watching George Floyd murdered on TV, it was horrific. And while we were still responding to riots and crises, we were talking as a community about diversity, equity, and inclusion and what it means here. Our city council established, we called it the Ad Hoc Committee on Equity and Inclusion. And we've spent the last 12 months meeting as a committee with myself as the liaison to the committee, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And they're all different. That was important. I got to learn the difference. I didn't know what they were. And so we got to talk about these things and what they meant. And the committee reviewed each one of our departments, all the activities, all the programs. They met with all the staff. And we talked about what diversity, equity, and inclusion meant for each one of the city's 7 departments. And the committee identified in total 44 different priority goals for the city to work on to become a more diverse, a more equitable, and a more inclusive organization. So that, for us right now anyway, has become this guiding document of how we can pursue more DEI within our community in Monrovia. That shapes the work we do in every department. So earlier this week, our fire chief, where we currently have 0 female firefighters, has been meeting with the Women's Fire Alliance to talk about how we can develop programs to train and develop female firefighters from an earlier stage. It's a very competitive marketplace in Los Angeles County for female firefighters. So how do we develop them? We're addressing the same scenario in the police department. We have 2 African-American police officers. How do we develop and train and grow our police force to be more diverse in this case, but also strategies for human resources for all departments to be more inclusive? we all might have diverse workplaces, but we may not have inclusive workplaces. What are we doing to be inclusive? How are we making sure that these different perspectives, beliefs, traditions are all part of the workplaces where we conduct important public business? So I think for us, that document, it's an actual report, and it's shared online. We share it openly with the public. That right now is our guiding document to how we can better improve overall diversity, equity, inclusion goals for the city.
That is outstanding. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that are watching this webinar today that will like to get their hands on it.
Can I charge a royalty? Happy to share it anytime.
I think that's outstanding, Dylan, that you have dug so deep in all of your departments on that aspect. And it's very beneficial, not only locally, but I'm sure would be beneficial to other communities that are going through that process or wanting to do a better job in that area. As you think about the work that you've done, and now as you start to think about ARPA, how are you using the information that you have for incorporating equity and inclusion considerations into your overall community needs assessment?
Well, we've benefited where, our report actually gives us some great goals that are actually outlined that we need to be accountable for in return. So we've got some great strategies we can work on. I think for me as a leader, we've taken a step back, assessed this direction we're heading in. And I think the first piece of advice that I tell our staff is, managers have to move forward on all kinds of different fronts. And right now there are so many different resources, federal, state, there's a lot of work being done. I think it's important that we don't replicate the services. We don't overload workforce development and not gain anything on communications or police reform, if that makes sense. So it's important to assess a whole variety of directions that we're moving in and try to allocate appropriately. In Monrovia, our key, I'll call it gaps, if you will, are, we've seen significant impacts on the workforce. White collar, highly educated workers who could work remotely were relatively impacted minimally during the pandemic. But retail and restaurant workers, typically lower income, and many of them are working part-time jobs with little benefits, were impacted significantly. So we've seen that there's this impact on the workforce, and what are we doing to build programs and services related to that workforce? Home ownership. We traditionally look at home ownership, rental versus owner, and we've seen a significant increase in wealth for people who own their homes. Last year in Los Angeles County, property values, market prices for homes went up 26% in communities like Monrovia. If you own the home and you were selling, you were building generational wealth. But if you were a tenant who could only afford rent, you were scrapping. And at the same time, you were working 2-3 jobs. You couldn't take leave time if you needed to go quarantine. There was a gap there. We have to address those kinds of gaps. We have open space access. In Monrovia, we manage a 1,500-acre wilderness preserve on the north side of town. Home values are more, higher incomes are more. We look at the south side of town, where we have closer proximity, residential adjacent to light industrial or even heavy industrial uses. We have a lot of concrete, a lot of roads, a lot of old infrastructure. Are we placing more green space in the southern part of town? So we use this information to try and determine how to move forward on any particular project. A great one that I'm proud of, just 2 nights ago, our city council approved. We have a new general plan amendment, a small development of a Chick-fil-A and a Starbucks, right? Everybody's dealing with Chick-fil-A and Starbucks. But what makes our project unique is the property owner is actually going to donate a very large piece of land as part of that development to be used for open space. So we've laid out all these plans and goals to create more open space on the south side of town. And now our community development department is using that as part of the development discussion. Now we're going to have green space on the south side of town that's completely donated by a developer who wants to get a project done at no cost to the city. So, doing the planning and getting moving in the right direction, I think helps managers. For now, when you have any particular issue come by, you can start bringing that diversity, equity, inclusion information into the picture and managing ahead. I think we have very grand visions with our ARPA funding. We have yet to determine how we're going to use that, but I certainly think that we're going to try to align it to where it's a one-time infusion where we can make a generational difference. We're not looking at putting it into, ongoing costs and programs. We're not looking at giving it out for wage increases or anything like that. We need to use this to really drive generational change. It might take a while, but how do we drive that change? And that's where our focus will be.
That's very cool. What a cool project with that development project. That's a great opportunity for you to have a conversation with the community about what to do with that open space and bring in all your voices of the community. Dylan, can you talk about how you're connecting with those populations that are just generally hard to get engaged with?
It's hard. And we have to think about engagement, not just as like a thing we do, but a way that we're ever doing the work that we do. Engagement it's kind of like ethics. We don't like, it's something that we need to build into managers as just a value, something that is part of everything we do at all times. And it is sound and solid. I think engagement is the same thing. People want to participate. They don't know how, they don't know when. Sometimes they don't even know what is going on. And how do you reach out and engage them? I think it's different for every community. Our community, they love Facebook. I hate Facebook, but they love Facebook. We have, maybe 4 or 5 community group pages, well over 10,000 people each for a small community of 38,000 people. So I push all my information out through Facebook. And that's how we engage people, because everyone's on the phone and everyone's communicating that way. Last year, we had a massive wildfire. And the fire's rolling up into town, and the firefighters were engaging, and we now were putting every bit of water on this fire that we could possibly have. The problem was we were going to draw down all of our reserves and run out of water. So we put out a message, put it out on Facebook, hey, everybody, conserve water. Today's your day to help fight the fire. People literally were calling everyone. The school district got calls, the city got calls. Turn off your sprinklers, don't take a shower, do this, do that. That's how we engaged them during that moment in crisis. So for many communities, it's going to be different tools, different abilities. And I think however they want to engage with you, that's how you got to go to them and build those systems, enhance those systems. But I think that's the way that we've tried to engage is through social media. We put a lot of information out on social media. Hey, you can vote here. We do little small surveys. We put plans out well in advance. So like the Chick-fil-A project we were talking about, that's been circulating on social media for 3 months before the council even considered it, because we want people to weigh in and comment and opine before it actually gets to city council. It's just kind of a culture that we've tried to build here where we engagement is just one of the ways we do business.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm really happy that you were part of this conversation today. A lot of just really helpful things. Thanks so much, Dylan, for congratulations on all the work that you're doing. And thanks for being willing to share, and be ready to get about 100 or so calls in the next couple of days to get all of that information that you put together.
All right, thank you.
Well, I'd love to shift over to Michelle's presentation now. As I mentioned earlier, we have put together this, what we call an ARPA engagement package that Michelle has actually developed. And it's really designed to try to help communities work your way through the community needs assessment and measure the effectiveness of using ARPA resources in your community. And it has been built, as Michelle will describe, with an eye towards equity and inclusion. So I'd love to just have Michelle provide an overview of the Polco engagement package and how it can help communities. Thanks, Michelle, for being here.
Sure, Matt. And I think we're going to pull up the slides, but wanted to start by saying that Matt said I had worked in government 20 years. It's actually been about 30 years of me doing research and evaluation for local government. And really the goal of my whole career has been trying to bring representative voices and hear from all types of folks bringing that to government decision-making, local governments and community decision-making. So when the Treasury put out the bill and really had this lens towards equity and inclusion, it really, I was very happy because, you know, the disparities that are pre-existing in communities and hearing from those folks is really key to our recovery efforts. The other thing that I was really pleased to hear about in the new bill was the fact that they really are urging local governments to talk to the folks that live in their communities, not make these decisions in isolation, but to really collaborate. So for me, again, the best way to kind of look at these issues of equity inclusion is to include the voices of all folks in the community. And so really glad the Treasury did that part right. And so we're excited, but we developed the ARPA engagement package in partnership with the National League of Cities and the International City and County Managers Association, because we wanted local governments to have the tools to basically be able to spend their funds, not just as Band-Aids, but more transformational or generational changes, bring those back in the community. And so the package is kind of geared, or it has a cornerstone of surveys of residents, residents from diverse backgrounds, all backgrounds, as well as business owners and managers. And we actually asked these folks to tell us not only about their priorities for the community, but also to tell us more about their challenges. What are the biggest challenges in the community, their households, their businesses, so we can understand kind of as a needs assessment, what's happening and where the biggest challenges our community faces and how we can actually best meet those challenges. We have those surveys, but we also have a lot of wraparound services activities that have to do a lot with collaboration. I'm hearing Dylan and Amie today, it kind of really reinvents the whole idea of like crowdsourcing and how important it is to share best practices. It's we're in the state of disruption right now. Very few leaders in American communities have actually faced recovering from a pandemic. And so the whole idea that it's a lot of trial and error moving forward, I think it's really important that we can share ideas. So we have parts of the packages sharing and working together with peer cohorts, identifying best practices through our data, identifying benchmarks, then also kind of working to develop performance insights with some of our professional partners so they can actually identify challenges at a national, regional, state level and help kind of provide technical assistance in the areas where we are seeing the biggest challenges in recovery. We also want to do some kind of next steps workshops to help folks once you get data and talk to these residents who are diverse and throughout the community and figure out the best way to move forward with our decisions based on what we find. Next slide, please. So the interim final rule from the Treasury really made sure we understand that this bill is about equity and inclusion. They basically cited a bunch of research that showed the pre-existing disparities in communities, those groups that were already experiencing a lot of challenges are experiencing them more. And so they basically are saying that they have data to support the fact that the lower income communities, the people of color, tribal communities, they had higher rates of COVID-19 infection, hospitalization. They experienced more unemployment, bigger issues with education, housing. And so we know that these chasms that were already in communities were actually in many places, they've grown stronger, they've gotten larger. And so they want to make sure that not only are we making the whole community get better, but we want to make sure we're also making the playing field for all our different residents and different businesses, you know, come up together, or actually even maybe decrease that chasm. Next slide, please. So the ARPA engagement package we developed, we took the disparity and equity ideas very seriously in this because we knew these types of impacts were an issue. We just lost our slides. But there's dashboards. We have actually a lot of components that are in the package that really deal with the fact of equity and disparities. And what's supposed to be on the screen right now is a disparity report that actually shows we're asking residents, like I said, their priorities for the community, what's the biggest issues in the communities, but we're also asking in your household, how much has this been a problem? Are you having problems with broadband? Are you having problems with water, sewer, education, parks and rec, all the things that the funding categories support? And so we're asking folks about that. And then we can actually, in these dashboards, demonstrate where the bigger disparities are. So in this example, you can see by income, rent to own, race, ethnicity, area of the city, but we have all different kinds of characteristics where the data can be broken. And you can actually look at the funding buckets that ARPA has said you can spend money on and look to decide where it is you see those disparities and where they're the largest. So when you're doing your needs assessment or figuring out how to plan your programs or focus areas, you can identify what kind of special strategies and interventions you need to take with different populations. Next slide. Also, what I love about this package is we're going to be able to track these challenges and opinions over time. And so we'll be able to say you decided food insecurity is a big issue, or housing affordability is a big issue in your community, we can look at the baseline percentages of folks that are having issues with these, and then we can track that over time to see not only are we bringing the community up or down in terms of proportions, and also is that happening equally? Are we making sure those folks who are hit the hardest, who've traditionally been marginalized, are those people experiencing the same gains from the ARPA funds, or maybe even more gains than we see from the folks who didn't need as much? So that's going to be a really important component in terms of you reporting back to Treasury, but also your host community about who you're helping, what the funds are doing, and if they're really achieving the goals that were intended.
Michelle, can you talk about the value that this information provides for community leaders who are trying to navigate through the COVID recovery process?
Yes, sure. We already talked a little bit, and Amie kind of highlighted it quite a bit in her presentation too, but the importance of hearing from folks and talking to folks. And can we get the next slide, please, to pull up? But we know, even though at first glance, it seemed like ARPA was going to be really generous and we're all going to get a bunch of money, if you start taking into account all the pre-existing challenges we had, and now you add on all the hardships from the pandemic, you realize there's so many ways we can use this money. So many possibilities, because it's not quite as controlled as CARES. So not that we can use it for everything, but there are lots of different categories we can spend in. And we know in communities you have competing priorities, but also some communities also have a lot of special interest groups. So a bunch of groups vying for the same funds, all of them making arguments to how you should spend the money. And so it is hard time right now in local government to decide how to best use those funds to kind of make transformational change. So we believe that, and the Treasury urges you to do this, we really need to bring the residents and your stakeholders into this community decision making. They need to be a part of it, not only tell you what the challenges they're experiencing, but also their priorities, so that you can become collaborative in terms of solving the issues that we see based on the COVID-19 experience. Next slide. And so through our toolkit, and actually through any kind of engagement with residents, we feel like you can actually engage them multiple stages along the way. So the first area we focused on, and which we think a lot of people are struggling with right now, is we first want to identify the needs that we need to address the most. With a lot of the competing priorities, is it affordable housing? Is it broadband? Is it education? Is it water sewer infrastructure? Where are we going to spend our money to have the largest impacts? So through our data, we kind of help electeds and staff decide where they want to spend the money, and also engage the residents in this conversation. We also I showed the dashboard, but we have a number of ways to really look at disparities. And again, that whole lens of equity and inclusion, and making sure that the strategies we choose are culturally competent, but also we're just really doing the best we can to reduce those disparities we saw pre-pandemic, and we see even greater now post-pandemic. We also anticipate using the toolkit and packages to help residents be part of kind of crowdsourcing and helping them to help us solve the issues. Some of the interventions communities are planning actually rely on human behavior and their residents participating or taking part in something. So being able to talk to residents about what kind of services, programs, policies work for them, that they're willing to participate in, that they'll be in support of, it's going to be an important part of going forward with this planning of ARPA. And then finally, love the idea of evaluating performance from the perspective of the residents and the stakeholders in your community. I mean, you would collect data on how well you've changed some parts of your community. But what will be really important is making sure that your residents, your business holders, the people you're trying to impact, feel those impacts, and the quality of their lives are better and communities better. So through the evaluation tools and showing changes in proportions of challenges and priorities over time, we'll be able to help local governments not only document what they've done, they'll also be able to double down on the programs that they're doing really well, maybe tweak the programs that need help, and maybe even abandon some programs that didn't work as intended. But being able to evaluate that performance throughout the 4-year cycle instead of waiting till 4 years and say, hey, yeah, that didn't work as we planned, is an important thing. I also think it's really important in this era when we're really working hard to develop trust with our residents, to have this accountability, the transparency, and really letting people know that they are partners in this and you're willing to be honest and show integrity in the process, I think is going to be a really important part. So the package does all of these things. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to go back to, like I said, I'm listening to Dylan and Amie today and the ideas they have. We believe a strong component of this is not just collecting the data of your residents and business owners and leaders and their opinions, but it's also really sharing that data so we can learn from each other, crowdsource, share best practices, identify blueprint programs, and kind of actually just help each other to all do what we're all doing, trial and error, and making sure that we spend the money the way we can and be as transformational as possible.
Michelle, First of all, thanks for that. That was a great overview of the package. Just kind of thinking about what Dylan and Amie had shared a little bit earlier about the levels of their engagement and how they're reaching their hard to reach populations. Excuse me. Can you talk about, or just kind of share with us the research that you've done about, are you noticing an increased level of resident interest on this?
Well, the one thing, so there are not that many silver linings from COVID, but one of the ones we have seen in our data and seems to be bearing out in a lot of communities is one of the problems I've had for the 30 years of my career is trying to have residents understand the difference between local government, city, state, county, federal levels of government. They are all confused in many residents' heads. So one of the things we think with the pandemic, we're noticing that residents are being a lot more interested in their own local government. They're able to differentiate them. While in the past, they may have confused them more. We're also seeing in our data that residents are actually rating their trust and their support of their local government higher than we've seen in the past, and definitely higher than what we've seen happening in states and at the national level. So we do think this has kind of been an opportunity for local government to shine and let residents understand that they are there for them and what you do, and also that you're like sometimes more immediate in terms of responding. And so we think that's a really good part or output of the pandemic, of the very few things that could be. So we're hoping that local governments will continue to hold this role with the residents and keep building this relationship so that they are more known, more differentiated, and more trusted as we move forward, because we don't always want to be confused with what's happening with the politics at the national level, just because that's not been good traditionally for people's attitudes and trust in government. So we do think that part is, a positive part. And I think we can continue doing that and hope that with the ARPA funding and being transparent and collaborative and accountable, we can keep building that trust in local governments and the collaboration with these groups. I loved the fact that you guys are reaching out to these, community champions and people in the community that can really start building these relationships for the long haul, not just for this individual engagement, but indefinitely to be able to work together to make the community better.
Can you share a little bit about your perspective? Dylan had talked about being very wise about the investment in the community's future and the importance of being long-term focused, and just kind of how you look at that topic.
Yeah, I think people can use the ARPA money as a Band-Aid, and I and people will do that. But I do think the whole idea of using this as a catalyst or transformational to help either reduce disparities that have been existing or bring everybody up in the community to the same level of quality of life is really important. And I think one of the keys is kind of looking at the data and understanding where the needs are, but also I'm really interested in making sure people evaluate their programs over time. You don't wait till the end, you make sure there's some evaluation component, make sure it's working, and make sure the outcomes that you're intending are what you wanted to. I've evaluated enough programs over time to realize even if you have good intentions, it may not have good outputs. And so to be able to make sure you're talking with the folks that you're intending to help and make sure they're partners in that process, I think that's one of the keys to making it transformational. The other thing that I'm interested in is once we can collect more aggregate data, once we find more issues, say for instance, we find that food insecurity is a huge issue. It'd be really nice to have thought leaders in terms of how you solve hunger. So it's not just food banks, but are we talking now about community supported agriculture and farmers markets? And are there ways to end food security issues in a community that aren't just about giving out free lunches? And so I think there's experts in the field and people who've struggled in these areas and really thought about how to make transformational changes in the area of affordable housing and food and workplace readiness, all those kind of things. And I think the more we understand a common need, the more we can get these folks working on blueprint practices, policies, programs that we know are successful, more evidence-based, and making sure communities aren't having to invent everything on their own, even though you may have a custom component of it, given your community's unique. But I do think a lot of the issues that the ARPA funds can be used for, there are folks who really know a lot about how to solve these in more transformational ways than what we've seen a lot of people in the past do, which is a quick solution or a Band-Aid solution to community problems.
Thank you for that. I would just ask if there's any questions that people want to share, let us know. I do want to ask Michelle another question, and that I've mentioned it earlier, but I'd love to just kind of have you add on to it. And that is this whole aspect of the way that it's structured and the value of the aggregation of data across jurisdictions. Can you talk about the value that provides to local governments generally and how that all works?
Yes, I love aggregating data and benchmark data, but I'm kind of a data freak. But what I like about it is actually my career started at the city of Boulder the first 8 years of my career. And I started collecting data on what residents, how they rated police and parks and economic development. And what we found is year after year, the same services, everyone loves fire, trash, and libraries, and everybody hates the planning director and economic development and streets. And so I felt bad because I go to meetings and, the librarians high-fiving me and, the economic development directors giving me dirty looks because I'm always saying the same story. So we realized, there's something maybe intuitive in terms of how people rate services and how satisfied they are. So we started collecting data from other cities across the nation. And so that was my first experience with benchmark data and realizing some things are just harder to do well. And it's also good to know that there's common challenges across communities. So that's our goal with the ARPA funds too, is to actually help you identify, because when people get a bunch of data back and they realize there's all kinds of problems and where should we focus, of course you want this whole community impact, lens to be like, what should we focus on unique to us? But it's also interesting to know, like, if everybody's struggling with this, versus no one's struggling with this and we are, that kind of helps you identify which areas you need to focus on. So in terms of a local community, it's great to just see where you stand to see, and also it sometimes gives you the magnitude of how hard it is to solve that issue. But the other thing I like about the aggregate data is I like the idea that we can combine together as states, as regions, as a nation, and talk to other people who can fund us or other people who can help us with our challenge and say, across the state, this is a huge issue. We actually want to apply for some more grants or do some more lobbying or advocacy. We want to make sure we solve this at a region or as a state or as a nation to understand really what the challenges are and what our strengths are so we can work together. So I think it's in that combination, that collaboration of people kind of pooling their data that we get a lot of insights. The final thing I want to say is one of the things we can do with our databases is we can identify the top performers by the ratings of the residents. And so as we move forward through ARPA, if we find people who have made really huge changes, say, for instance, in food security or housing affordability, we can talk to those folks and have those folks, write books or do webinars or write blogs and say, this is actually what we did. This was our plan. This is how we were able to achieve such great change in a year. So the aggregation of data is really important for all of those things in terms of us all getting better.
Yeah, the other thing that kind of resonates with me is if you're a smaller community, which most of the communities in the country are, the ability to tell a story with only your data doesn't come with as much strength or validity as if you're able to aggregate data from all small communities. So you can kind of benchmark with each other and understand where those challenges and successes are. And being able to tell that broader story, I think, is such a powerful thing to be able to do. So I appreciate you sharing that, Michelle, and providing that overview. I am seeing in the chat, you will see a quick survey that we're asking everybody to respond to. If you go to polco.us/feedback, we're really hoping to get your input on your reaction to this webinar, other areas that you would love for us to share more additional information on, questions, just general questions about how you are approaching the ARPA program. So thanks for taking advantage of that survey. Really appreciate it. And all of you should just be aware that we'll send you this recording if you're registered for the session so that you all have the benefit of this information. As I'm waiting for a couple of questions to come in, I just really want to thank Dylan and Amie for being part of the conversation. The things that you're doing in your communities on behalf of other local governments is just really amazing and awesome. And it's nice to be able to have you as part of these kind of conversations, just to share what you're doing and the successes that you're having. So really appreciate it. I will wait for one more question. I don't see anything coming in, so let me do this. Let me just thank all of you for attending the session today. Really appreciate your time. By all means, let us know if you have any questions or if there's ways that we can provide assistance to you as you're navigating your way through the ARPA program with a special eye on equity and inclusion. So thank you for being part of the session today.
Actually, we do have a couple more questions that we can, answer in a minute here. One of them is, are any municipalities already using the package? We do have a couple, I believe, signed up and getting started. I also want to ask any one of our speakers, what's one thing you know now that you wish you knew in 2020?
Buy stock in Amazon.
Oh,
We all have seen this challenge and been talking about this challenge of brick and mortar versus online. Who would have thought the pandemic would have just made it go like that? And even all our local brick and mortar, even our restaurants now have figured out how to run business online. I think that was one thing that who saw that coming?
Very true. Amie.
yeah. There's so much, but I think just knowing how much technology would impact everything and how quickly we could actually move. I know Dylan talked a little bit about government and all of a sudden this fast movement. I think I wish I knew that we could do it because there were moments where it was dicey and it continues to be, but having that faith has been really helpful.
I'm curious, Dylan and Amie, just in these final minutes, are your councils and boards, are you virtual or are you doing a hybrid?
All of our electeds have to be in person because the state open meetings law mandates that they're in person, but communities can continue to attend virtually. So we've been working in that way.
Okay.
We're
Dylan, how's it?
virtual, scheduled to go live on September 7th, but we're going to be, that's very tentative because of the Delta variant. So we'll see.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. That's kind of what I'm hearing from around the country as well, that people are moving back to virtual, but they're staying tuned.